Welcome. My name's Ellen Broad. I'm Head of Technical Delivery for Consumer Data Standards at Data61, and I'm really excited to have Stephen and Dali on the panel with me. I have Dali Kaafar, who's the Group Leader for Information Security and Privacy at Data61, as well as the Chief Scientist for Optus Macquarie's Cybersecurity Hub, and also Stephen Hardy, who's Group Leader for Data Platform Engineering at CSIRO's Data61. And we're talking about new frontiers in privacy-preserving technology. So, is absolute privacy a myth? Can we create value out of data sets while still ensuring anonymity? How do we keep data secure and private? These are some of the questions that we'll be digging into over the next half an hour. But I wanted to open with language, because already in those high-level questions that I asked, some words were referenced like anonymity, privacy, and so we use terms like anonymization and encryption all the time. We often seem to use privacy and security interchangeably. So how do I know when my data is anonymized? Maybe I'll open it with Stephen and then go to Dali.
Sure. Thanks very much, everyone. So I always like to think of it as a game that you play with someone else and your data. So I bought a coffee this morning at a shop. It had my name on the credit card. You know, it's attached to a transaction. If the name gets removed, then it's considered anonymous most of the time. But it's only anonymous to the group of people who don't have the other bits of the data already. So that transaction, very trivial thing, sends it off somewhere else, someone reads it, that's fine. But if it goes back to the coffee shop owner, who happens to know me and knows that I come in at 8:30 in the morning and get a coffee, then the data's not anonymous to them, though it is to everyone else. So I think the first thing about anonymity, I'd say, is not it's not an absolute state. It's a gradation between, depending on who you're talking about and what other data they have.
So Dali, can data ever be truly anonymous?
All right. I think I'll be a little bit more controversial with this one.
And you might have to speak up a little too.
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So maybe a little bit controversial with this one. You mentioned things like de-identified data and de-anonymization, and we mentioned things like absolute privacy. So in short, actually, I don't believe in either of them. I don't believe in things that are called de-identified data for many different reasons. One of them is that, and actually most of computer science, by the way, will agree with this one. If we consider some data to be presumably de-identified, that would mean that we are considering this data as just one piece of data that is sitting there by its own, right? And the fact is that in today, we don't have that sort of context, right? Absolute privacy would mean that we really don't know anything about anyone at a point in time. Let me just give one example of the fact that absolute privacy is actually a myth, right? It's a complete myth that doesn't exist. So let's take a case of a study that has been done, let's say in 1959, about some sort of correlation between some disease and people eating lots of sugar, right? Now, absolute privacy would mean that with the existence of that particular study, there is nothing that would be revealed about people. You can't learn anything new about someone, even if you know something about him, right? Like, for example, if you consider John eating a lot of sugar, absolute privacy would make it sure that you're protecting John's privacy, but not knowing that he has that that sort of disease. And the fact is that with these correlation type of data sets out there, we immediately know something new about John. So myths like this, absolute privacy, de-identified data, and so on, are quite common, to be honest, in the current ecosystem. And this is something that, to be honest, terrifies me.
Stephen, do you agree with that? Is absolute privacy a myth?
So, on the whole, yes, but I think there's one particular circumstance. So if you consider that sometimes data is often encrypted. So when the data is encrypted and you don't have the key to the data, it's still data. It's just not useful to you, but it's certainly de-identified. Right? So in some very academic sense, encrypted data is de-identified data. Right?
So de-identified data would exist if you have this data completely encrypted or completely randomized with no utility at all.
Yeah, but then we're talking about new frontiers in privacy, and you know, one thing that's been available for many years but is becoming actually, you know, engineered software now is this idea of doing computation on encrypted data. So you're actually getting some insights from your data, but the data remains encrypted throughout the computation. So you're just computing on data while it's still encrypted, you get an answer and you reveal the answer, and that's all you reveal. Now, revealing the answer breaks the notion of perfect privacy, but that's a very, I think it's a very academic notion. As an engineer, I don't really care about things being perfectly private, but you can get utility out and still keep the underlying data secret. And that's something very new and will change a lot of things over the next 20 years.
Exactly. So basically, back to this point, that means that we really have to be a little bit more pragmatic about notions of privacy, being aware that some information can be leaked out of some data, and that's what we often refer to as utility of the data. We have to extract something out of this data. Now, I would like also to think in terms of being a pragmatic optimist when dealing with data, in the sense that, yes, data will be used one way or the other. We will get some insights of the data, but we would like also to be optimistic in the sense that there are protection methods that can make sure that we are protecting or providing a level of guarantees from a privacy point of view to the customers or to the consumers or whoever is actually being involved in that particular data.
I like that phrase, pragmatic optimist, because I think that characterizes a lot of the work that both of you do. But what worries you about what you see happening outside of the realms of study that you're working in? So we've kind of talked a little bit about what excites you and what you're optimistic about, but what, I want to use the word terrifies, but I'm a bit afraid that that's too dramatic. But what concerns you at the moment?
I'll go, okay. Did it ever happen to you when, like, you're reading a book and you really know what will happen in the next page, right? There will be no surprises. I think what terrifies me in terms of data protection and privacy these days is the fact that I'm having this feeling that over and over we're seeing many of these scandals, many of these little disasters from a privacy point of view, and people actually handling and processing data coming again and again, and like somehow there are no surprises, right, in the way that people are treating privacy. So I've seen too often organizations, private and public, unfortunately, in Australia, but also in Europe and US, thinking that they are doing the right things when it comes to protecting privacy in the way that they're handling the data, in the way that they're processing data. But they are doing this somehow in an ad hoc way, without necessarily, you know, having the formal guarantees or the formal proofs that whatever they're doing to the data is indeed private. And that's actually the crux of the problem, I think, when we are dealing with things and notions of, you know, privacy, is that we don't necessarily have this perfect knowledge of what does privacy risks mean and what are the limits that, you know, in the way that we're using our data that we have to go through, and basically to ultimately being not 100%, but to some extent a little bit more sure about the risks, and at least having sort of quantified risks when in the way that we're handling this data.
Before going to Stephen, I just wanted to follow up on your comment about organizations doing this in an ad hoc manner. And I'm wondering why, so I immediately think, is it a resource problem? Is it an expertise problem? Is it a cost problem? What makes it difficult to be more robust about privacy?
One little thing I would like, just on that, right? I've always wondered what would be actually the worst thing that could happen to, let's say, a privacy officer or a information security officer within a company. I guess actually the worst thing that can happen to some roles like this is to wake up one morning and realizing that they're making the headlines, right, in the newspapers, right? But I actually do think that it's even worse than just making the headlines. It's making the headlines where you're really convinced that you've done every single thing right to not make these headlines and still making those headlines. And I think this is related to aspects where people are, again, doing things in a way that is probably private or probably secure. And the thing is that if things are probably secure, well, probably they aren't, right? And most of the cases, we end up in situations where some perturbation techniques, aggregation techniques, de-anonymization techniques are applied, you know, just like that, because intuitively it makes sense. But the thing is that, you know, advances in machine learning techniques, advances in statistical knowledge and so on, proves them wrong again and again. And this is like, you know, the case that I'm talking about, no surprise in a book type of scenario that you have. And I've seen too often cases like this happening.
Stephen.
I think if we built planes the way we build data systems, they would fall out of the sky. Right?
It's a great image. I
Yeah.
mean, terrible image.
It's a real problem, and it's that engineering thing, right? It's the process of engineering compared between something like plane manufacture and software engineering have completely different levels of assurity and you know, quality control and all of those sorts of things. And you know, there's underlying engineering principles that really make things safe. And in the case of privacy, we haven't unpacked the underlying principles well enough yet to make things safe. Right? So we've sort of got the cart before the horse. Like we're running, we're doing all this stuff. Everyone's getting spooked by the fact that, you know, you looked at something on the web the other day and then there's ads following you around the rest of the web forever. You know, because all of this stuff is being used now before we actually understand how to do it properly. And so that's the fundamental problem. So we've got to fix that by working out how to do it properly and then doing it properly. So,
do you want to you go and
well,
then I'll ask a
sometimes
question.
it's actually also about the lack of knowledge of the fact that some technologies does indeed you know, exist. The other thing is that I think some people just think about privacy as an add-on, as a feature that actually they would like to have in their system. Sometimes it's just actually a ticking the box type of exercise. And sometimes it's also like, you know, I'm really willing to have some privacy guarantees for my data processing, but I'm not really keen to pay the price. And the fact is that actually privacy does come at a price. I mean, there is no free lunch here. When you're trying to include some guarantees when it comes to privacy, for instance, when you're releasing or sharing data with your partners, there is a little bit of cost to be paid there, which is perhaps in terms of utility, right? And I think organizations should be aware of the existence of technologies that can help, you know, providing guarantees when it comes to privacy of their data processing and data sharing and so on. But they also have to realize that there is a level of cost induced by perhaps, you know, not enough utility as they would have expected, at least not 100% of the utility than the original data.
I want to return to the aviation metaphor for a moment because I've just realized it's exposed a flaw in the way that sometimes I talk about the computer industry, where I describe it as a young industry, which is why we're still learning from our mistakes. We're still figuring out what safe looks like. But actually, aviation isn't a lot older in terms of commercial aviation. So I'm wondering, like, obviously the incentives are different. In aviation, failures are literally high impact. How do we incentivize better privacy-preserving practices in organizations when we don't actually have the equivalent of, you know, people falling out of the sky? Like, how do you make it real?
yeah, and that's the key thing. You know, Scott McNally famously said that privacy is dead, that no one cares about it. And it's true to a certain extent. There's the boiling frog phenomenon where everyone just gets used to doing more and more and more, but then, you know, something happens and elections get fiddled and there's, you know, data that's been misused by other people and there's a bit of clawback and then, you know, again, more data gets used in lots of different ways and then there's some regulation that comes in, more privacy gets guaranteed by law. It is a back and forth, but it all comes down to whether or not people value what it is that they're losing. But you can't value something that you're losing if you don't know really what it is that you've lost. Right? So.
On the aviation example, right? So in the air transportation system and the security of the air transportations, all of us, to some extent, are involved in the security. And, you know, we even sort of see all this inconvenience in going through the security gates and you know, going through the customs and like making queues and so on, but we still do it because we feel that we are part of the, you know, the safety type of system. So all of us somehow are involved and are really willing to be, you know, to go through that inconvenience. Same thing with the data privacy, right? I think organizations should be involved in this. Obviously, customers and whoever is actually having and holding data, and data custodians and data stakeholders should be involved and should be running through, to some extent, a little bit of inconvenience that processing data in a private way may induce.
So one of the comments that you were making earlier, Dali, was about utility. And I work a lot in open data and data sharing. In a way, I feel like this is about me being exposed more to privacy-preserving technology than I otherwise would be working on that side. But often we characterize data sharing and privacy as being in tension. That, you know, you could have utility or you could have privacy, that we see them as being somehow opposed to each other. Do you think that's an accurate framing of kind of the utility and privacy kind of debate? And what are the kinds of trade-offs that we're making in moving to privacy-preserving technologies? So maybe I'll start with Stephen.
All right, so I think it is accurate that there's a tension between, you know, utility and privacy, but the role of technology in this is to move the bar of that trade-off, so that at the moment the trade-off might be very strong, that you give up a lot of privacy for utility, but if we can invent the right algorithms, come up with the right systems of governance to actually control the privacy loss, we can get higher utility for the same risk. So that's the purpose of, you know, there's 3 stands which I'll advertise. There's Dali's group stand over there, and behind the Pratari one and the M1 Analytics stand. They're all different bits of technology which are designed to improve the trade-off between the utility of the data, the value that you get out of processing the data, at a fixed level of privacy. Right? So you want more for your privacy loss, as it were.
Yeah, so I think there is no question about this tension between utility and privacy guarantees. Now, we build technologies to enable that sort of trade-off to be optimized, right? We'd like to have, obviously, ideally, you'd like to have 100% privacy guarantees versus 100% utility. Again, pragmatically, this will probably not happen. But I think actually building trade-offs and optimal trade-offs here is the role of computer scientists and data scientists and so on. But finding that exact trade-off point, right, that you have to pick when you're using the data or sharing the data, is perhaps more of an economics problem, perhaps even you know, involving policymakers and involving government and legislation. So scientists and technologists can help finding algorithms to have, you know, to walk through that curve of the trade-off, but it would probably not help you finding what sort of risks are you willing to take, or what sort of privacy guarantees you need to provide your data with.
So I'm working on a project that I know I've spoken to both of you about that involves personally identifiable information that is being shared as granular, personally identifiable information. And it poses the question for me, in what circumstances do we not use privacy-preserving technology, or when, or should we be using them all the time?
So if you consider the notion of privacy by design, right? So you think about the privacy trade-offs you're making up front. So often the first thing you think about is the end user. Whose data is it? Do they consent to the use of their data? If you're in that situation where you're interacting with someone and they say, yes, I'm quite fine with you using my data in an identified way, then that's good. But if you then put this privacy by design hat on and the engineering safety hat on, that you want to protect the data as much as possible, if there is a solution that has, you know, higher privacy or higher protections, yet gives the same outcome for the end user, you should use it. Right?
Again, maybe to the the risk of being a little bit more controversial here, I think we shouldn't give away our privacy, and we shouldn't be consenting to the use of our data without privacy guarantees. Consent means something, right? Like, means probably that we're giving away some of our data under some level of trust. I think history has shown this idea of trusting companies to do or to process the data has proven us wrong in many different occasions and instances, right? And I'm not going to talk about the Facebook Cambridge Analytica case and many, many others. But the day you actually give your data away or you consent for your data to be used, you basically trusted that company or that organization to be using it in that particular way. So there is here a little bit more than trust and consent. There is also some unknowns regarding how this data will be used and who will be having access to this data further, right? So traceability is something that we cannot really guarantee today with the current technologies when it comes to data being processed. Accountability is not something easy to achieve, right? So in short, I would actually say that I really don't believe in cases or scenarios where we should be just giving away some of this personally identifiable information under any trust circumstances.
Stephen.
I guess the pragmatist in me disagrees with that. I like to think of it like a bike. We all understand the economics of bikes. You have a bike, you give it to someone else, you can't ride the bike, right? You give it to someone else, they return it to you and it's broken, you know it's broken. Right? Data is not the same. Data has different, you give someone else your data, you can still use your data. They can use it for things that you didn't think they were going to use it for. They might change it subtly and you don't even know. Right? Building the characteristics of objects and real things into the data pipeline is like this multifaceted technology stack where you have things like, how do we trust the code that's being used to process the data? How do we trust that the data is protected all the way through the pipeline, that it is encrypted all the way through, right? That the end use that the data is put to is the end use that was said it was put to. So how do you put the characteristics of physical objects back on data? And it's a really hard problem, and it's going to require some substantial rethinking of the entire stack from the bottom to the top.
Yeah, maybe another analogy that I actually like to think of is, everyone probably here has heard of this data as a new oil, right? But in the
data is a what?
New oil, but actually
Data
in the early days of the oil industry, everyone was really rushing into using oil and as a type of energy, and we realize today that's probably not the best solution when it comes to environment. And I'd like to think of this way of us, giving away our data as potentially some form of pollution, right? That we're creating for the next few decades, where this whole ecosystem would be full of our data everywhere, and we don't know what could happen with this data that we gave away. So we really have to be careful not to pollute the sort of environment with data, by free use, basically.
So I'm conscious we've got about 5 minutes left. So I was wondering if anyone had any questions. Yes, and hang on, I might have to hop off and give you a microphone. I'll do it, Stephen, so then you can answer the questions, because I think I'm the only one with a microphone. In heels.
Thank you. We've heard a lot of the problems. I'm just wondering how you may see, this is two questions, self-sovereign identities, being able to look after your data, possibly using zero knowledge proofs, but also in My Health, the government wants to de-anonymise My Health data to give to insurance companies and healthcare companies. How trustworthy should we be with that data being de-anonymised?
I'll take it. So actually we talked a lot about problems, perhaps. We talked about risks, but I think we can talk a little bit more maybe about potential existing technologies that can help in providing this trade-off. And sometimes actually a little bit more than trade-offs. Perhaps sometimes there are different types of trade-offs, not necessarily utility versus privacy. There is actually sometimes some sort of trade-off between privacy guarantees versus computation resources and so on. So solutions and technologies exist actually to make things happen while extracting insights without seeing the data if it's encrypted, or actually without necessarily being able to identify individuals in the data sets by some formally proven technology to add specific noise, etc., etc. So, for example, authentication and digital identity management happens a lot today in a privacy-preserving fashion, right? We have techniques that enable ways of extracting specific features that makes it really unique for individuals to authenticate them, but also at the same time keep that unique, those unique features about the individual's secret and private enough to not be misused. So basically, I think that's a really good question about the possible solutions and the possible technologies to be involved in many different scenarios that do exist. And maybe there is actually a very quick one. There are actually ways today of quantifying these risks, by the way. So we can formally quantify the risks so that we really take informed decisions when we're processing data, for example.
So I'll just rattle off some technologies that I think form part of the solution. There's homomorphic encryption, zero knowledge proofs, differential privacy, provable, trustworthy computing, all of these things layered together. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of how that might happen, but there are all of these potentials. But what we as a research organisation need are people who are willing to try these in practice to actually make them scale, make them robust, fit them into business process, etc. Yeah.
I accept the iTunes terms and conditions. My question is, how can we make consent meaningful and useful in the digital privacy context?
Yeah, and iTunes gets a good score for being quite open and transparent. So I think I saw another one that had 290 pages of terms and conditions. So, yeah. I have no solution for that. Yeah, perhaps the RegTech guys might.
Actually, if this is showing something, is that I think today's industry is competing to offer privacy as a feature and is competing to offer privacy as a business differentiator. Whether they're successfully doing this is a different story.
So I didn't see... Was there one more question? Hello?
Oh wow, it's loud. Cool. Just a quick question when it comes to data research, or when you're collecting raw data for researchers, how would you approach? Okay, I'm about to do I need to collect data from possible users which will just basically indicate which way my research should go. How do we approach privacy when working with not patients, participants, especially when they're working with sensitive topics or sensitive high-risk areas?
Yeah, I'll have a go at this. We do a lot of work on this particular topic, and it's about matching the controls you have over the people who are using the data with the sensitivity of the data. So if you have no controls, as in the case with open data, you want to be really, really careful about what you release and how it's released. But if you have very sensitive data that you want to give to a few trusted people, that you can audit everything they do, that you can watch what's happening to the data, then you can give them much better data. There's a very nice framework called the 5 Safes framework, which sort of plays out the 5 different ways that you can trade off data sensitivity versus where it's done, what it's done for, who's doing it, and I forget the 5th one.
What's the project about?
Right.
So yeah, that's actually in the core of the sort of technologies that we were referring to earlier, I think, and they're really depending on the sort of scenarios that you're having to go through, whether you trust the environment where the research is being done, whether you trust the environment where the data is being done, if it's really to be open and shared publicly and released publicly, or whether it will be shared within a set of trusted entities and so on and so forth. And there are many different techniques depending on the different scenario.
So I'm conscious of time, and I know some people still had some questions, but I'm afraid we have to wrap up. Please do find Stephen and Dali during Data61 Live. You can also check out, Stephen's already promoted some of the booths on display in the exhibition hall. And I just want to say thank you for listening and for your patience with the big space that we're in, and to thank you, Stephen and Dali, for what I thought was a very interesting and kind of argumentative panel, which I don't think always happens. So I think it was good to have some debate. Thank you.
And thank you, Ella.